Hello, my name is Saied Abbasi. Today we'll be doing Death of the Media Query as noted. Thank you for your patience. We had some last second little hiccups. Okay, so as noted, my name is Saied Abbasi. I am the founder of WPHelp.co, and I am a web developer at the organization BFC Support, which is a New York-based dev agency that does do a fair amount of work in higher ed. What we are going to be talking about today are media queries. And while this is a little bit fuzzy, we're just seeing how these pieces are jumping around. And what this is illustrating is what a media query is, if you are not familiar. Media queries are what allow us to create these breakpoints in our web design. So here we're seeing something that's maybe like a desktop, but as it gets a little bit smaller, you get to a tablet or a mobile device. And in order for the layout to change so dramatically, we insert these breakpoints via media queries. When we think media queries, when these first came into the coding world as a standard, the original conception was this idea that we had desktops, tablets, mobile devices. However, as each of us are aware, as we browse the web, the size of your screen, whether that screen is a TV or a massive monitor or a laptop on the go or a big laptop or a tablet by Apple or a tablet by Samsung or whatever, the device sizes vary so much that it's no longer these consistent breakpoints, but rather just the desire to have fluidity across all devices, which can be really tricky to implement, and it can be really time-consuming if you try and get very precise and surgical with the way that you are implementing these breaks in your code. And what I will be suggesting today is that we begin to use some new standards in CSS design code in order to create more fluid design across devices without having so much headache and upkeep. So the three tools that we'll be going over to alleviate our need to lean so heavily on media queries will be the calc function, Flexbox, and CSS Grid. And while I will dive into a reasonable amount of code, I will try and keep it at a level that conceptually it'll be easy enough to follow along with where we're trying to steer things away from getting really precise. Okay, I also know that if you happen to be a coder and you're the one making all these changes, that it can be a little bit challenging or frustrating to learn something new on the fly or to implement it into production. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that this be a holistic change, that every designer, every coder go and learn every new bit of CSS standard and implement it immediately, but rather that you take it bit by bit and try and build it in, fold it into your work as you're going to save you time and to create code bases that are easier to maintain. And here, if you happen to be a coder, I am trying to provide an image of maybe, whoever you're making the site for, while a very kind person may be out for dinner on a Friday night and give you a last-second phone call asking for some new feature, and that can be really challenging to implement by the best standards when it's Friday night and it's late and you just want to go home or something like this. Okay, so there are also challenges when it comes to implementing new standards in code around browser compatibility. And oftentimes this comes down to Internet Explorer or Microsoft Edge. And in the higher ed world, there's not often as much flexibility around which browsers we use. So there are challenges in this in making sure that you have the right, that you're using the right code that will be accessible to anyone on any browser. However, if you want to use these things, I recommend that you visit the website caniuse.com, and you can put in the CSS spec that you are curious to use, and it will let you know browser compatibility across the board for most browsers. Now, this screenshot was taken in early to mid-fall of 2017, so I can only imagine that browser compatibility has improved. And here we see calc compatibility for Chrome, Firefox, IE, Safari, etc., Flexbox across the board, and CSS Grid. And all of this is rapidly changing and rapidly gaining more and more compatibility. When we see yellow in the corner, that does mean that there are some warnings to particular properties or values within that bit of CSS. Last little bit of primer is this tweet by Jen Simmons, who counter to this fear of making sure, or this fear of will browsers be compatible. If you're curious about the mystery if they're compatible, go to CanIUse. If you're being superstitious perhaps about it, then Jen Simmons has this quote for you that the New York Times is using it on their production site. So for what it's worth. And then I lied, the last bit of primer. If you are not familiar with CSS, it happens to be an incredibly consistent language in the syntax that it's using. And here, what we're doing is a very simple CSS rule. It's targeting an H1, which is usually the title of a page. It's saying the type of change it wants to make, color, and then it's saying what that change should be. So make the H1, the color, red. Okay, so let's take a look at the calc function. In a very basic example of what the calc function is doing, we have a CSS rule that is saying, take the box, make its padding, which is creating space inside of it, the outcome of 200 pixels minus 100 pixels. So what calc allows us to do is do a bit of math in our CSS. And while it's not particularly handy in this example, as we could just put 100 pixels in there, we could do the math ourselves, it becomes really handy when you're dealing with different values, such as if I wanted to do 100% minus something, or if I wanted to just create a standard, which we'll look at in a moment, rather than having some decimal running off the page that would be hard to do consistently throughout my design. So a bit more practical example would be if our box was 100% of the width minus the 100 pixels over here on the right, we just take it out. I found this handy recently when, and I apologize that it's not a higher ed website, but when doing this bridal website here, I received these templates from Photoshop. And when you have Photoshop templates and you want to take them and create a website from them, it can be a little bit tricky to try and get a sense of like what the scale is, how this should actually look on a computer, how it would look on a tablet or a mobile device. Is it extra? Will it always be rectangular? Will there be times when it will be a little bit more square? And one of the trickiest aspects I find in all of this is trying to get the height just right and make things proportional. So what I did when I rebuilt these templates into a website is I used the calc function to control the height proportionally throughout my design. And a simple example of how this would be utilized is, let's say that I had what I'm calling hero image here, but any sort of banner image or really any image on a website. And let's imagine that this box on the right half of my screen is the entirety of a website. And I land on it and I say that I want 40 view height, which is essentially 40% of the height, to be this banner image. And then I can use the calc function to make other areas of the site proportional to my top box. So I want these to be 85% of the top banner image. If all the math is driving you crazy, the takeaway here is that I have this new way with calc function to really cleanly state that I want other elements on my page, these bottom two boxes or this bottom box, to be proportional to something that I can give a consistent height. which is new and really powerful versus going in and creating media queries and giving everything specific heights, finite values, which can be really tricky to deal with across devices. I want to quickly show this example by David Bachmann, who wrote an article called Between the Lines on CSS Tricks. And what he has done is he's taken the calc function and he has built it into his own function that he calls between. I'm going to more or less jump over the code, but what he has done is he's done some magic. It's scary, oh no. When we look at it in CSS, he's taken the calc function, he's turned it into this thing called between, and what he has done is he's created a range. And if we go back to the shot one more time, we've seen in modern web design the ability to pull our screen's width and control things scaling across width for the most part, even though there are some tricks in there. But what uniquely is happening here is that we're getting the effect of a slope. This box is growing in width while shrinking in height, which is pretty amazing and incredibly fluid. When we look at this applied to an entire layout, we end up with something like this. And we're focusing on this top green box here. And what we're seeing is that this box is growing at a slope. Its height and its width grow together. Typically, when we're looking at breakpoints in design, we're limited to something more along the lines of this, where our box suddenly jumps to half its height or increases to double its height. So this would be a classic media query versus Bachmann's use of the calc function. Okay, this is our tree of serenity. We're looking at code. Code is hard to look at when someone's just talking to you. Our tree will calm our brains. Our neurons are firing, much like the branches here. And now we are ready for Flexbox. Okay, so Flexbox is amazing because it allows you to control horizontal spacing and vertical spacing. And imagine this again versus trying to say, I want this thing to be 100 pixels and the thing next to it to be 800 pixels, and really trying to map out this width in finite values, while the leftover space will always be varying depending on what device size you're on. Flexbox handles all that leftover space in a really simple way. So first, we need to have some basic HTML just to consider how we're applying this. So in this scenario, I have a nav tag. My nav tag has 3 links inside of it. So this will be a basic site navigation. So we have home, about, services, all inside of our navigation tag. In order to use Flexbox in the world of CSS, we will need to create this parent-child relationship. And we simply do that by targeting the parent, in this case, the nav, and we say that we want it to display Flex. Now we have all the powers of Flexbox at our disposal. So let's take a couple of looks at how handy this is in controlling horizontal space. And we control horizontal space by using the property justify content. And we have a variety of values. We're first going to take a look at the value center, which will allow us to, regardless of the width of the device, center our link elements inside of this parent nav flex container. And this, okay. And then let's take another look at this with justify content space between. And what's happening in this instance is we are creating space between each of these elements. So all the space that exists on the width of this device is taken and placed between our links. In this case, we have 3. If we were to have 4 or 5, it would evenly distribute the space between each of these links. Next, let's take a look at space around. Space around is taking all the space and dividing it into equal increments left and right of each item. So what's going on here is that home will have a little bit of space on the left, a little bit of space on the right, and the same for about and services, all divided equally across these boxes. And this, again, is not it doesn't matter how wide your device is. If you're on a mobile device or on a desktop, Flexbox will just account for that space and distribute it in the fashion that you are describing with justify content. So these are the additional values of justify content, flex start and flex end. We took a look at center, space between, space around. This is essentially the start, and this is the end. We also have the power to control the vertical axis, which historically in web design has been incredibly challenging. And a lot of our solutions up to this point have been a bit hacky to try and push things into the exact right coordinates on a page, while Flexbox gives us the same abilities that we're distributing leftover space on the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. And we do that using the align items property. And we have the values center, stretch, baseline, flex start, flex end. If you are familiar with Flexbox and these two properties, there are some caveats as to whether this is horizontal or vertical. I'm not going to dive into those, but just in case you're the handful of people in the audience who are snickering at how wrong I am. Okay, so when Flexbox becomes, I want to show you this. With align items, just a quick visualization of how this is working on the vertical axis. We have an example of flex start, where orange boxes are items stuck to the start. At the flex end, the bottom, center, stretching across the width, and then baseline would be based on the text. All of these can be incredibly handy. When Flexbox becomes really powerful is, for me, when I find it most practical, is when I'm dealing with these content type cards, if you will. So oftentimes on a website, we'll have these data cards, and whether they have a box around them or not, what's happening here is that we have some sort of content that's going to have a title, it's going to have some text to describe it, maybe there's an image, maybe there isn't, and then we have some links. And to have this content consistently displayed on this card, spread out top to bottom, left to right, can be really tricky without knowing the exact text that is going to be the title, going to be the description. However, with Flexbox, whether or not we can write all the code immediately on our first go to place everything where we want, Flexbox allows us to think of this as sort of a container and its childs, and we want to distribute the space in a fashion that's advantageous to us. So while this is a little bit more complicated, if we just think about it as two boxes within our Flex container, the red line here, that we want to distribute the space vertically and have one at the top and one at the bottom, we can do that. If we want to have these two items centered within our Flex container or red box, we can do that. If we want to nest our Flex boxes, which is also possible, we can create a new Flex container, this inner lower box, and we can distribute the children inside of it, left and right. Here's another hurdle when it comes to these content cards. It's not just that you won't know how much text you're going to get here, or if these elements will be consistently placed in the proper corners of our box, but it's that sometimes the height of these elements by the content that's in them will not be consistent. And that can be really tricky to design out when you don't know in advance whether it's the first card that's going to be extra tall, the second, or the third. However, when we make this into a Flexbox and we use the align items property stretch, which happens to be default, we get consistently sized cards, which is a very common struggle in design. Okay. Neurons firing, tree of serenity, moment of peace. Okay, the last bit of this that we're going to take a look at is grid. And I'm going to give us some low-level vocabulary around grid, why it's special. I'm going to give one or two kind of cool use cases, and then I'm going to just briefly put some breadcrumbs as to why grid areas are cool, and you can do your own research from there. Okay, so Grid is a big buzz in the CSS world. And the reason that it's so cool is because now we can do art and publishing and everything online, kind of. One of the reasons that Grid is so cool is because it allows us to create white space on our website and to create overlap in a new way that we've never really been able to do before. So here are some cool designs that were obviously not originally, but done by a web designer, Jen Simmons, using CSS Grid just to show how it's giving us some really new and powerful ways to create design on the web. So let's rewind back to looking at our HTML for a moment. It's a very similar concept to what we were looking at with Flexbox. You're going to have some sort of a parent container. In this case, it's our section. Inside of our section, we're going to have 3 child elements, our header, our main, and our footer. If we wanted to utilize the powers of Grid, we're going to take the parent container, which is section, and we're going to say display grid. And now we have all the powers of CSS Grid at our disposal. So let's take a look at a couple of examples using the new FR unit. But first, we'll take a look at a basic example. So I've updated our HTML. Now we have a parent of wrapper, and inside of it, we have just essentially boxes. And our boxes on the front end will say A, B, C, D, E, F. And we'll take a look at what that looks like momentarily. I've taken our container, which is wrapper in this case, and I've said display grid. So now I have all the powers of Grid at my disposal. And now I'm using this new property, grid template columns. It's not hyper important that we remember all these properties or whatever, but this allows me to state, and in this case, explicitly state how many columns I want to create in my grid. And when we're imagining CSS Grid, we're imagining essentially like a table or an Excel spreadsheet. And we're laying that on top of our web design, and we're controlling the size and the spacing of those cells in a way that has been challenging historically in web design. So this would spit out something like what we're seeing on the right side of the screen. We've stated explicitly that we want 3 columns. So that means A, B, C, fill in our 3 columns. Each column will be 100 pixels wide. And then Grid will automatically, even though we haven't said how many rows we want, start to fill in the next row with what it finds in our HTML. So automatically D, E, and F are filling in left to right for when you are designing on websites that are using languages that read left to right. Cool. Okay, we're going to take this one step further with the FR unit. The FR unit, just like pixels or percent or anything along these lines, is a means of specifying what type of value we are using in our CSS. The FR unit is uniquely available in CSS Grid, and it stands for a fraction. So used in a grid, we could do something like this, where we're creating a new grid. We're saying that we want it to have 3 columns, and we want each column to be 1 fraction. And these are relative to each other, so in total there are 3 fractions, and that essentially equates to having this divided into thirds across our screen. These values, unlike 100 pixels, are fluid across devices to grow and shrink relative to each other, always 1/3. Now, historically, we have had the ability to control space in a similar fashion using percentages, but where the FR unit becomes really handy is that we can mix and match our units together in the sense that we could have a column that was a fraction combined with a static value. So let's take a look at that. This time around, I'm creating a grid that is 2 columns. The first column will be 250 pixels, a static value, regardless of whether I'm on a desktop or a mobile device. And the second column will be a fraction of what is left. So 250 pixels static, and then 1FR will just take the remaining space that the 250 pixels doesn't need. A design that, so let's take a quick look at this. We have our static 150 and our 1FR, but our 1FR will grow and shrink across devices. Cool. This might end up being really handy in a situation where you have maybe a blog feed and you have an image, and images can be really tricky in responsive design to let them grow and shrink because you might lose context as to what you're trying to show in that image, or as the image gets really small, essentially what I just said, but you might end up like cropping out what you're really trying to show in that image. But if you can control the size of that image by giving it a static value, and you can let the other space be used by something that looks really good growing and shrinking, like text, you have a responsive design that's much easier to maintain and has less headaches across devices. If we wanted to take this one step further, in our last example, we're dealing with a static value and a fluid value. If we wanted a little bit of fluidity in our static value, we could utilize what's called minmax. And what minmax allows us to do is it lets us give two values for one thing. So in the examples that we'll be looking at, it will be two values for a single column. And they create a range of a minimum and a maximum. So let's take a look at something similar to what we were just doing. Except in this case, we're still creating two columns. One column is from min-max all the way to here, and the other column is 3FR. So our min-max is saying, don't get any smaller than 250, but grow to 1/4 proportionally to the other 3/4 that are here. A little bit hard to just hear, but when we see it in action, we have these 250 pixel images that are actually bigger than 250 pixels at this point, but as we shrink and get small, they bottom out to the minimum of 250 pixels, but they have the ability to grow to 1/4 relative to the text 3/4 as the device gets bigger. Cool. We're gonna jump into looking at some kind of cool designs, messing around with image galleries and flexible columns. This gets a little bit tricky, but visually it's kind of cool what you can do. So up until this point, we've found that we could create fluidity within our columns using 1FR. We found that we could create combinations of static values and fluidity in our columns. And we found that we could create a range of fluidity with a static value using min-max. But all the while, we were still explicitly stating how many columns we wanted. Let's take a look at this image gallery that Jen Simmons has created. And across maybe a desktop view, we see that we have 7 columns here. These columns can grow in width. These columns can shrink down to 6 columns. Or this grid can shrink down to 6 columns. It can shrink down to 4 columns. It's crazy. It's so fluid. Okay, in order to do this, we're going to take a look at the repeat function. The repeat function gives us a way, just like min-max, to create a little bit of a bit more direction around what we want to do in one call. So what does that mean? So in this case, we're saying repeat 3 times 1FR. So what I have written up here at the top is the equivalent to what is written here at the bottom. 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. However, we're still stuck with this fixed value of 3 columns. And what we're trying to achieve is fluidity in our columns as well to account for smaller width devices up to desktop width devices. If we take repeat and we combine it with the keyword autofill, and autofill is another bit of magic that exist inside of CSS Grid, meaning that I have some HTML, I take its parent, I say display grid, and I open up the doors to all the magic of CSS Grid. And now I have access to the FR unit, which we looked at a bit ago, to control fractions. And I also have access to this new keyword called autofill. And what autofill will do is, where we used to be putting a static value of how many columns we want, it will automatically fill the space available with however many 100 pixel columns, in this case, can fit. So we end up with something like this, where the columns will grow, these 100 pixel columns will grow to fill the available space, or they will shrink and create new rows depending on the device width. There's a little trick here that I still want to account for, which is the fact that we're left with this lingering white space as the device is between these ranges of when a new row will fit. And we're perfectionists, and we want to see how to fix that. So, because we're saying there's a static value here of 100 pixels per column, and it doesn't fit, and then it fits, and it doesn't fit, and then it fits. We already know how to create a range that is acceptable for our columns, and we can do that with min-max. And while this whole sprawl is a little bit overwhelming, we have it broken down into pieces that conceptually we can ingest what this is saying. We're saying repeat, which allows us to create multiple columns. And we're using autofill rather than giving it a fixed value to allow us to say automatically fill the available space. And then when it comes time to give the width of our column, we're saying that our columns can be as small as 150 pixels. Otherwise, they can grow to fill the remaining space. And as we saw in the last slide, they're having trouble filling that remaining space. There's this empty white, empty white, empty white. While in our new grid, we have columns that will grow regardless of device width. And we see here that B will jump up to the first row, C will jump up to the first row, D will jump up to the first row, once there is enough space for a new 150 pixel column, and in between, each column will grow in width. Now, this versus trying to go in and say with a media query, A should be 300 pixels, and then it should be 100 pixels, and then it should be 300 pixels, back and forth at different widths, is really amazing what you can do with fluid design here. Okay, so this is just some fun extra magic that's in CSS Grid, and it's near the end, so just watch the magic and let it I noted this in a recent talk, but I thought it was a really good reference. My girlfriend's getting her PhD, and she was assigned some reading that was written by two philosophers, and apparently the book does not have chapters, and it chops back and forth between like who's talking, and it's intentionally not written in order. And her professor assigned the reading to her saying that soak in it like a bath, and then she corrected herself and said, no, rather, let it wash over you like a shower. So if at any point, or if it already happened, any of this was a little bit overwhelming, let it wash over you like a shower. In theory, it's cool what you can do with these things, and if you're inspired to start applying them, they will really save some time. Okay, so the last bit of this is still CSS Grid, and what we're looking at is flow. With CSS Grid, what we've seen so far is if our HTML is written in order of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc., it'll fill in that way within our page. However, we see in this case that E does not fit where we would predict it to go, and so it jumps down to the next line. We have the ability with CSS Grid to say grid autoflow, this new property, and to give it the keyword dense, which allows us to, or the grid will automatically go forward with the grid A, B, C, D. It has E, E doesn't fit, it puts it here, and then the next cell it comes across that fits in an empty space that it previously skipped, it will automatically go back and put it in that cell, which is really cool. We end up with fluid design that would look something like this, which is pretty amazing. Our last tree of serenity. Okay, grid areas I'm just simply going to talk about. There's no slides after this. Grid areas, in theory, I encourage you to go to, not in theory, in practice, and I encourage you to go and check it out. When we deal with our HTML, it is very much written in this fashion of top to bottom in the way that we look at it on a page. So you'd have the header, and then you'd have a title, and then you'd have a paragraph, and then whatever else all the way down to like your copyright down at the bottom. When your code is written in this fashion and you want to design it, the design is very much locked into the order that your code is written in, top to bottom. However, on a mobile device or on a tablet or on a desktop, it may be more advantageous to move one of these pieces around, even just a little, one thing in front of the other. Grid areas allows you to treat your design on a web page or treat your markup, your HTML, with an incredible amount more flexibility. You can essentially place on the page where you want pieces to go at different design widths. It's very cool. I have an elongated version of this presentation at the link provided if you want to take a look at those slides. There's also some links here at the end to additional resources. So if you have ongoing concerns about compatibility, I encourage you to check out caniuse.com. There's also something that you can include in your CSS called @support, which will essentially skip over the code if it is not supported. Oftentimes in web design, if you're a designer, you might be leaning on something like Bootstrap or Foundation, which give us columns. And columns are how traditionally we've controlled spacing across devices. With Flexbox and with CSS Grid, our reliance on these frameworks seems less and less a necessity. If you want to play around with these things at an entry coding level, I encourage you to check out Flexbox Froggy or CSS Grid, or CSS Grid Garden. There's a talk on WordPress.tv by Morten Hendrickson. I hope I have said his last name right. And he does an excellent job describing these things, including grid areas, which I skipped over here at the end. If you want to see like some pretty examples of what these things can do, I encourage you to check out Jen Simmons' Labs site. And then if you want to learn everything about CSS Grid, take a look at Rachel Andrews' blog or Grid by Example, which is a website by Rachel Andrews that has a lot of useful examples and tutorials. Okay, that is it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions. As of right now, the Ask a Question feature in Crowdcast is without any questions, but it looks like we have one or two in the chat. I'm going to move them over to the Ask a Question section, and you can go through and answer those with the few minutes we have.
Cool. Okay. So the first question is, could you also use min-max to grow the height proportionally with the width? That is an interesting question. So I don't have the answer. I think the only case that I've really seen height and width grow proportionally is in that David Bachmann use or creation of the between function, which is on, it's near the end of the calc section of my slides, and it's also detailed in a CSS tricks article called Between the Lines. That is the only time that I can really think of like this really brilliant growth of width and height together. There's also in these slides the use of view height, which is a cool way of controlling height in proportion to the height of the screen. And that is a nice way of proportionally controlling height. I think that part of the danger of controlling width and height together is things growing off the screen, though in David Bachmann's example, it does look really nice. Last little bit in response to that question of minmax. Minmax is a function that lives outside of CSS Grid. A few of the things that I showed within CSS Grid are only usable within a CSS Grid container. Minmax can be used outside of a CSS Grid. I've never messed around with it with height, but that is an interesting question. I'd be curious to know the answer myself. The next question that I see here is, so what things do you still use media queries for? What are the limitations of using CSS Grid and Flexbox? Okay, so you can't, unfortunately, the title is exciting, Death of the Media Query. However, it is perhaps a bit of an overstatement. So for example, the grid areas bit that I skimmed over at the end, part of what's really cool about it, I was trying to explain, is that you have the ability to place your HTML elements where you want them on the page, regardless of where they appear in your HTML. So if your HTML is written top to bottom in correspondence with your web page, top to bottom, you could grab the bottom and put it at the top if you wanted. In order to do that in a logical fashion, you might only want a piece from the bottom to be up at the top on a mobile device, in which case, in order to do that, you would use a media query. Media queries also still resolve a lot of edge cases here. So Flexbox is great at controlling space, but when there's no space available and you need things to just be smaller, you need a font size smaller, or you need padding smaller or something like this, it's nice to still be able to jump in with a media query and tweak that out. Limitations of CSS Grid, there will be some challenges with compatibility that if you are trying to be considerate to older browsers or to be Internet Explorer or something along these lines. Cool, that one has its answer. So the top question I see is, I have been using Flexbox, but continually have trouble with Safari and Internet Explorer not rendering correctly. So I wind up writing extra media queries to target those browsers, even though Can I Use suggests they're mostly supported. Any suggestions? Okay. I don't have a solid suggestion or an answer or a fix for you. There are inevitably frustrations when dealing with different browsers. And each time that I've given this talk or something kind of similar to it, it is often followed with a particular bug. I hear of a particular bug in Internet Explorer that makes these things still challenging. I've had a fair bit of luck in those browsers, and I don't know if that means that I'm not fully using everything that Flexbox has to offer, or if there is something really specific in Can I Use, or if it's a version of Safari that's a little bit older than I'm testing on or something along those lines. But I don't have the hard fix for you. One interesting thing that Morten Hendrickson suggests in his WordCamp talk that's on WordPress.tv, that's referenced at the end of my slides, is he suggests that we stop trying to bend and break to be compatible with every browser, but rather, just like in the fashion that we have a mobile site, we can have an Internet Explorer site. And I'm not saying that every client or higher ed facility will be comfortable with this solution, but I did think that it was a really enlightened way of thinking about browser compatibility, because Internet Explorer hasn't received a major update in, I think, like 4 years or something like that. So, okay. What about font size? Do I still need media queries to adjust, or can I use minmax or something else to automatically increase or decrease depending on container size? Okay, so font size is a little bit tricky. So there are times when you will jump in and likely just want a media query to fix something with font size. However, there are also relative units that you can apply to font size. So rather than doing something like minmax, you could use ems or rems. And for example, this might be something like you give it sort of a base value, and I would encourage you to maybe to read on this, be honest. But if I had a base value of 16 pixel font size, I could then create relative values to that. So my header would be 2 rems, and what that will allow you to do is still likely use a media query to change the size of headers, but you get sort of a universal standard for what those font sizes should be, which is maybe hard to understand from me just saying it, but from messing around with it in practice a couple of times, it can really save you a lot of time doing font sizes across devices. There are also relative font sizes based on like view width. So you could have a font size by view width, which can get tricky on real small devices, but it's a pretty cool way to think about responsive design and font sizes. There's also a good CSS tricks article on that, view width and maybe view height in relation to font sizes. Okay, I think the last one. Oh, there's an in other words follow-up. I need to read the first part first. How well does Grid and Flexbox play with existing layouts and styles? Do I need to rework an entire layout to introduce these, or can I tackle individual areas without the grid flex areas interacting poorly with other things like existing media queries, tables, fixed layouts, etc.? Okay, so just from reading this question, I know that you, and from the other questions, a number of people here obviously have experience doing this day to day. And when you do this day to day, you are fully aware of the fact that there's always something in the code waiting to trip you up. So yes, there are going to be trips and traps. However, I have on existing websites absolutely gone in and I've tried to think of like nice areas to target. Like I had an example with Flexbox of those content type cards, I refer to them. And it's just a card of data of like an image, a title, an excerpt, and then some buttons. When I see things like that that are laid out next to each other, 1, 2, 3, or maybe rows of them, that to me clicks as a really nice area where I know that these are going to need to shrink and grow. I know that these are maybe going to be on one line and spread to another line. When I run into those situations, I will employ Flexbox. I'll employ Grid, but I'm still doing it with that @support item referenced at the end of my slides, which is essentially just saying, like, if you can't handle CSS Grid, fall back on my Flexbox solution. It can be a little bit tricky. I use Flexbox all the time, everywhere. I try to contain it in the sense that I'm not doing my entire layout always. If I'm writing a site myself, I'll write it in Flexbox and I'll control space in that fashion. And I'll use media queries to sort of create those breakpoints when necessary, when things are too wide. But if I want to do a navigation, Flexbox. If I want to control vertical or horizontal spacing within one row of content, Flexbox. It can be harder when you're dealing with legacy code bases, absolutely. I think that is it. Thank you. This was awesome. I appreciated being a part of this, and thanks for staying late into the day.